Okay, so first of all, I just want to say, per grades, I'm going to get into the grade book and update all the grades. So far, everyone has full points. My goal with this class, in terms of how I structure the grading, is you show up, you do the discussion boards, you're going to almost guaranteed have a 3-point. What's going to separate out the 3s from the 3.5s, 3.25s, 3.75s, 4 points is how do you do on the paper and how do you do on the final exam. So I feel like if you're showing up and you're learning material and you're participating in class, like that is the point of this. But we do need to have some sort of final sorting out of who learned the most. And so you don't need to like sweat your grades at this point. All of the graded stuff is at the end. And when it comes to the papers, those of you who've had me before know, if you're writing your paper and you're like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing a good job or not, you can bring it to me or send it to me by email. Say, can you just give me your thoughts on this? Like, what grade would you give this paper if you turned it in? So you are all welcome to do that. We're still a ways away from that, obviously, but I just want you to know. Okay, so as you can see here, Cicero and his times is what we're doing. Let's just review where we were previously. We started with Plato and his Republic, right? And we had that idea. We had lots of ideas, but specifically to this class, we're interested in political philosophy, and specifically in institutional structures and laws and how states are set up. We saw that Plato, his formative experience was the conflict of the Peloponnesian Wars, the conflict between the different orders of society, the different classes of society, and the 30 tyrants and the death of Socrates. And he sort of believed that there was that hierarchy of best governments, there were 5 of them, and that it sort of repeated ad nauseum in a cycle. And that there wasn't a whole lot you could do to prevent that, unless you had the rule of like a philosopher king. Aristotle is much more concerned with pragmatic practice, exercise of government. Remember, he is the student of Plato, who was the student of Socrates, and unlike Plato, who was still there and living during the golden age of Athens, obviously he experienced Athens' ultimate defeat in the Second Peloponnesian War, but Aristotle, by the time that he is mature and writing his really advanced, developed work, things like the Politics and the Nicomachean Ethics, Greek power has been on the wane for some time, and it is being eclipsed by their northern neighbors, the Macedonians, right? And when he founds his school, he sends out all his little graduate students, and he says, look, it seems like all these different types of regimes are able to exercise some degree of effective power and control and to deliver some degree of happiness and prosperity to their people. Let's just collect them all and analyze them. And this led Aristotle to produce the famous graph that we looked at, where he said, look, actually, it seems like there are 3 basic types of regimes. There's rule by one, rule by a few, and rule by the many. And just knowing whether there's one, a few, or many doesn't tell you whether or not they're providing prosperity or the rule of law. That was Aristotle's big one. Is the society governed by law? That was his big one, and it's something that Cicero, we're going to see, is very, very influenced by. But not to jump to Cicero just yet, I want to finish up with Aristotle. So when you're thinking about the differences there, Plato is very concerned with idealism, right? What is the ideal form of government? And he has those 5 types of government that he thinks are best, right? And that these are going to recur throughout. Aristotle, by contrast, believes that there are just perfect and deviant forms of rule. So kingship versus tyranny, right? Aristocracy versus oligarchy. Democracy versus basically mob rule. I'm not going to use the word anarchy because I just don't like that it's used that way, because it has a very specific political connotation within later developments in political philosophy that we are going to talk about. People like Robert Nozick, who writes Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So, okay. That being said, Cicero. The formative experiences of Cicero's life was going to be political instability and republican decay. Remember, Aristotle is going to say that probably the best form of government is going to be some form of compromise, right? He favored finding that happy medium where all the different powers kind of feel like they have a stake in government, right? And this is going to be expressed by Cicero here as sort of the high Roman Republican period, where essentially all the different parts of society have representation there. But he's reflecting back on that. Okay? By the time Cicero is writing, which we are doing on the Republic is what we are reading, for those of you who have already looked at it in the syllabus. Unlike someone like Plato, who is talking about how we create this perfect republic, because this is exactly the text that he is hearkening back to. He's even going to have a little bit of dialogue in there. It's kind of harking back to Plato, but it's much more readable. It's much more readable than Plato does. Cicero is basically of the belief that like we had this thing, and it has degenerated now to where I am. And so I guess I'll just kind of launch into like, yes.
Would you call that reactionary then?
Not necessarily. Simply because I look at reactionism or the reactionary forces as specifically directed against like progressive tendencies in government, which was very much not what was happening in the Roman case, which we will get to here in like probably like 5 to 10 minutes. So if you have questions when we get there, I'd be happy to answer them specifically if need be. So the expansion of Roman power. So I mentioned last week that while the Macedonian Empire is rising, the Romans are consolidating political control over Italy. Because with our big high view of what's going on with history, we tend to think of Italy being populated by Romans. As we can see here, there are all these other different tribes. You have the Etruscans, and the Vii, and the Samnites. And it was only slowly that Roman power expanded outward, right? Very slowly. There's Rome, and as we can see here, this didn't translate terribly well, but basically a Roman trade at 500, 338, 298, 290, 272, 264, and 218, which is right at the outset there, I believe, the Second Punic War. And this is the famous one with Hannibal, where he comes over the mountains. Okay, so this was the gradual expansion of power. Yes, it is because here, these islands, here's Carthage right here. Carthage is going to be home of the descendants of the Phoenicians. That's why it's called the Punic Wars, by the way. So you see like the Latin Wars, the Greek Wars, the Macedonian Wars, and then you hit like the Punic Wars. It's like, why is it called the Carthaginian Wars? It's just because that was the Latin word. Like the Romans would have called them Punics. We call them Carthaginian stuff. So that's what's going on there. These islands here, the Carthaginians had a massive seafaring empire, and they were starting to spread their influence to these islands off the coast here. And so this is what sets up the ultimate showdown here, because by this point, all of this is under control of Rome. Okay, so I'll jump ahead here. Monarchy. So initially, Rome is a monarchy. This is kind of like mythic stuff. We don't really have great sources for this. And we're talking about stuff that happened in like 700 BC. So you kind of got to take what they say with a grain of salt here. Because of course, you have Romulus and Remus in the founding myth, and they connect that back to the Greeks because they're fleeing the Trojan War, and they're the descendants of Aeneid. Who's read the Aeneid? Virgil's Aeneid. Okay, so that's a later work of propaganda during Augustus's time. But that's what they're harking back here. There is a final king, King Tarquin, which I don't know if you can see it on the map here. It's actually one of my favorite cities in Italy. It's right here, Tarquinia, right here. So Tarquin was the final bad king of Rome, and he's such a bad king that the great whatever grandpa or something of Brutus, the Brutus who helps murder Julius Caesar, they band together all the aristocrats and throw him out. Okay, and he attempts to come back. He partners with some of other local kings and warns that the people are getting restless, and first they chuck me out and they're going to rule themselves out a king. Next they'll be coming for you. But Rome is able, we're told, to fend that off, and the republic is established. It's a very aristocratic republic initially, very closed off, and there's going to be a series of essentially progressive moves to democratize Rome over the centuries. This takes place over centuries. So, Yep, and initially, again, it's just one little city-state among many. In fact, it gets into a lot of skirmishes, a lot of battles with its neighbors, and it loses some of them, but none that are so consequential as to ultimately destroy its power. Okay, so these are my big overview maps. Yes, okay, so these are my big overview maps just to kind of give you that big broad sweep of where we are in the history here. I really need to start wearing my glasses. Okay, because I need to stand close, but I don't want to be right in front of it so you all can see, so I'm going to bring my glasses. Okay, so, what was I saying there? Okay, the Western Country, yes. Okay, right here. So sorry. Okay, right here. So look right here. Yes. So, Carthage. All right, it's a trading empire, right? Along North Africa, that's North Africa there, like Algeria, Morocco, all of those, they weren't called that, so it's just North Africa. And as you can see, they were just a seafaring empire that set up, outposts along the sea here. Like down below here, we start to get into like the Sahara Desert, right? Northern Africa here, the coastal region, lots of good ports. They're setting up here, so you can see that there's an obvious power struggle setting up here. Like, this would be like the Thucydides trap, the two great powers rubbing up against each other, and there's going to be war. And the war actually starts over Sicily, which, as you can see, is about equidistant there between the two of them. We think of Sicily now as like, well, it's obviously part of Italy, right? But it's been ruled by a number of powers other than Italian powers throughout the centuries. I believe as late as the 1600s, it was ruled by the Spanish kings. So in this case, it's being fought over by the Greeks, the Carthaginians, this random band of like mercenaries, and ultimately the Romans. And so they come into conflict over this. When they win, the Romans take over all of this, right? And they become undisputed masters of the Mediterranean. It becomes the Mare Nostrum, our sea. And they are the dominant power here. Now, and this is going to have consequences for the political development of Rome. Because one thing that we're going to see when I jump into the narrative here is that even though there was a lot of factionalism and political fighting in Rome, both among the noble families, the patrician families fighting for power, the different social groups and economic groups fighting for power, the one thing that always kept them together was a dangerous common enemy. That, we can argue among ourselves, but we have to stay together. At all costs, we have to stay together. We're in a tough neighborhood. We got to go fight against all our enemies. In fact, at one point, there's like a tribune of the plebs, which is kind of like the democratic voice in the government, kind of accuses the patricians of like constantly trying to stir up wars and conflicts with their neighbors in order to distract from, what they viewed as sort of a basic inequality in the society here. But it is ultimately the destruction of a real enemy that is actually dangerous, that is going to, many argue, myself included, is ultimately going to send us straight down the slide to dictatorship ultimately. Because it's a very quick jaunt actually. This is Rome right here. This is Rome at the time of Caesar's civil wars. So there's the first round of civil wars that we're going to get to, which is Sulla and Marius, which Caesar was related to Marius. I think he was married to Julius Caesar's aunt, I believe it was. But then this is Gaul right here. That's where Julius Caesar goes and conquers. This is the east, where Pompey, his rival in the Caesar civil wars, will conquer. And there, of course, is Egypt, which will ultimately start feeding the Roman population. This is how they're able to afford to do like those big grain handouts to the poor of Rome. So, okay, all right. So, got to refuel on the coffee here before I start diving into the legal and political developments here. I just want to give you kind of a view of the neighborhood there. Okay, so, all right, let me jump into it here. Okay, so the early monarchy, I had said that the mythology is that it was founded by Romulus in 753. You get several more kings, the seventh of which is Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. He's the last king. He basically tries to, well, I don't need to go into that. Basically, he gets thrown out. The Roman Republic is established in 509. This date is generally considered to be highly suspect, just because it's like so close to the founding of democracy in Athens, which is pretty well accounted for in terms of like texts. and this is like literally like it's like a couple years before that. So the historians I've read basically think that the later Roman historians who just like they just couldn't suffer being second at anything, basically like changed the date and made it like just before Athens. So like we were actually the first ones. So okay, so the basic structure of the Roman Republic. You had the Senate, which is the primary political institution, and it's dominated by the patrician class. These are the elite landowning aristocrats. And you had two consuls. These were elected annually, and they had all the power of a king. Okay? And there were two checks on their power in the early system. One was that they could only rule for a year, and after that, you had to go back to being a private citizen. So, okay, if you're breaking the law while you're the consul, okay, you're going to be a private citizen here in a year, and the Romans were extremely litigious people, very litigious people, as we're going to see in their development of the legal system, and they would prosecute you without question. The other check on their power was the second consul. The idea was, look, if one of them goes crazy and tries to start passing all these tyrannical laws, the other consul can just veto these laws. So, very quickly, however, we said what, 509? Yes, 509. By 494, so within a generation, you get what's called the first secession of the plebes. Now, the plebeian class was all the other guys, right? Who were out working, doing the trades, serving the service, all that stuff. They're excluded from political power, right? They're initially excluded from political power. And the mirroring here of the development of the early American Republic is it's so uncanny because, of course, they adored the Roman Republic. They were huge fans of this Roman, actually, I think he was Greek. I think he was a Greek historian writing about Rome named Polybius, but he wrote about the period of the High Republic. So basically, the plebes, they're going to go on strike because they've been fighting these wars and stuff, and they go into debt while they're gone, right? Their family needs to be fed and whatnot, so they go into debt. And if you couldn't pay your debts, you basically got made into a slave, basically. And so they were petitioning for debt forgiveness, and they weren't getting it. And so they waited until essentially there was like danger right at the doorsteps of the city, and they were like, yeah, we're not fighting. And they just kind of went off to the mount near the city and waited for the patricians to come beg them to come back and promise to treat them better and take care of their needs. And this ultimately winds up in the creation of the tribunate, which is the representative of the common people. And in a later development, they'll get 10 of them. Now, the tribune had actually a lot of power, as we're going to see, and it's the tribunate and the expansion of the powers of the tribunate that is going to cause a lot of instability when it starts being used in a certain way, which we're going to see. The 12 tables, the laws are written down. This is huge. This is actually a huge one. Always beware of so-called limited constitutional governments when the Constitution isn't actually written down. When you don't have a Bill of Rights that's actually written down. I look at what's going on in the UK right now, in England, in terms of just the outrageous violations of free speech. And it's like you don't have something that you can point to say that we have this guarantee. It's just a series of laws and decisions that have been made throughout the centuries that just pile up, and that's the Constitution. So always beware of that. So we're lucky to have that. Basically, the plebes say, look, the laws, they aren't written down. We show up to court, and then a bunch of patricians tell us what laws we did or didn't break and how the rules are supposed to be applied. We want them written down. This is a big development. Roman expansion. So that right around 450, you have essentially all the pieces in place. So you have the consuls, you have intermarriage. You have intermarriage because initially it wasn't legal for you as a plebe to marry a patrician. And so what it created was a closed off aristocracy, right? Because only patricians could hold the highest offices. Things like consul, things like high priest. The name of their high priest is escaping me at the moment, but Roman expansion across Italy and the Mediterranean. So we already talked a little bit about this in terms of going about and conquering their neighbors. The biggest ones were the Samnite Wars. The Samnite Wars were important, not so much because they were an incredible power, but just because of their location. I'm actually going to bring up the other map. they were just really, really close to Rome itself, and they were up in these mountains here, right? So they're very hard to defeat because they're up in the mountains, but they're also close enough that if you send a large force north or a large force south, and they decide to use that opportunity to attack Rome, that could cause serious problems for you. Or if they decide to start cutting off your baggage trains and stuff, which they will occasionally do. And I don't think they fight and win the last Samnite War for a couple of hundred years. They fight, I think, 3 or 4 of them. It's definitely 3. The Pyrrhic War, the Greeks dominate down here. The Greeks dominate down here. Remember, we said one of the great causes of Athens' decline is they were attempting to go and conquer Sicily. Well, it didn't stop just because Alcibiades had a terrible expedition. The Greeks went there and they set down colonies. Sicily then and now is, a very wealthy place in terms of its agricultural produce, and of course it's geostrategically very important as well. Just look how narrow that choke point is here. If you want to cross that portion of the Mediterranean, you have to sail by there. Very important place to control. So, and this brings us to the Punic Wars, 264 to 146. So, an entire century of war, basically. The first one, as we recall, was fought over control of Sicily. The second one is fought actually almost entirely. It's like a generation of war on the Italian peninsula. What happens is the defeated general's son from the first war swears that he will get revenge, and this is Hannibal Barca, and he crosses over from Spain, which, as you can see here, this is a very small crossing here, crosses over, goes down through there, and he's actually like this totally unbeatable military mastermind. I won't go into it, but basically the Romans only survive by just kind of outlasting him. They use the leader they finally elect is called Fabian, and he survives by avoiding battle. And so here's one say it's a Fabian strategy. It's a strategy of wearing out your opponent by avoiding battle. Yes?
Why do you think Hannibal didn't march on Rome?
There's all sorts of reasons given for that. One, the biggest one that I've seen is that he was convinced that his display of power, defeating Roman army after Roman army, would cause these tribes, these other Italian tribes who Rome had subjugated, who were not yet Roman citizens. They won't be Roman citizens for another century, what's called the Social War in the 90s. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. He was convinced that these subject Italian peoples would eventually just rise up and throw Rome off. And he feared that if he attacked Rome, that it might trigger kind of a rally around the flag effect type thing. Because like, hey, we are all still Italians, and here's this, crazy North African general who's gonna, it does work. Like, we see the rally around the flag effect today, right? So that is the major 2 reasons that I've seen, is that he was convinced that he could stir up a rebellion, and that number 2, targeting Rome specifically would be deleterious to that purpose. So, he's eventually forced back to Africa because while Fabius, I think his name is Fabius, he's part of the Fabii family. He's one of the really rich patrician families, like the Claudii family. They're distracting over here. They basically send a massive army to Carthage, and so he gets recalled to defend Carthage, and then he's defeated on the plains of Zama. But anyway, that almost brings us up here. That almost brings us to the life of Cicero, because Cicero, as we can see, 146, Cicero is born in 106, so we're almost there. So, the life of Rome, so far as we can see, has been a gradual evolution of democratic government and a constant territorial expansion under pressure of war. War is creating the unity of this society. At the conclusion of the Punic Wars, 146 BC, which results in the total destruction of Carthage, it's going to set the stage for their dominance of the Mediterranean. Now, they've already defeated the Greeks. There's really no threat from the north at this point. Now no threat from the south. So this is going to start making the Republic insanely rich, obscenely rich. I mean, all the wealth of the Mediterranean is going to start pouring into Rome. So, reasons for its collapse, the Republic's collapse, because spoiler alert, the Republic is not long for this world now. Growing economic inequality. As Rome is expanding, conquering lands, the wealthy elites are moving and creating these massive, massive estates. So instead of a republic of small land-holding farmers, what you're actually getting is these massive plantations owned by a handful of wealthy aristocrats based in Rome who are not even hiring these small Italian potential farmers as tenant farmers anymore because slaves are pouring in, right? And remember, slavery at this time was just a function of, did you lose in battle? Okay, you're a slave now, right? They're conquering all these tribes, all these peoples, and bringing in tons of slaves to work the lands. So and what happens to these dispossessed people? They tend to concentrate in the cities, specifically in Rome. They begin agitating for reforms to address what they see as totally unfair, because these small holding farmers who are being forced off their lands, these are the legionaries who just won all these wars. So imagine you've been gone on campaign for 10 years and you manage to survive somehow, and you come back and you find that your wife and kids, your farm has been basically the equivalent of like repossessed and bought by this rich landowner. And your family is living in some like tenement housing in Rome. And you're all broke, and this was your reward for serving the Republic. So it's very easy to see how this did not play well, right? And you have these couple of guys, they're called the Gracchi, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They attempt to address this, right? Now, these two, it's important to understand, they are traitors to their class. These are patricians. They're the people. In fact, they're from like the highest of the high patrician families. In fact, one of them is related by marriage to Scipio Africanus, who defeated Hannibal, right? So they're like in the highest circles of Roman patrician life. And here they are trying to use their power to do things like take away land from their fellow nobles and give it to these rabble out in the street. They are killed. They're both killed for their troubles. And this is important because it's one of the first times that open violence is used by the Senate. That basically Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus are using the platform of the tribunate to try and advance a certain agenda. And when they are unable to stop it by legal means, there's a resort to violence. Now, the situation's a little more complex than that. Tiberius especially got way overzealous and probably did some stuff that was not strictly constitutional himself. Gaius, I don't think did, but I'm not an expert on that. Anyway, it is a huge turning point there because it was just naked violence. It wasn't, we outfoxed you politically. No, it was just, we are in charge because we hold the money and the violent ability to suppress you. So, the decline of civic virtue and political corruption. All this money that's coming in is being used to buy offices in government. No longer is it a question of who has served the state meritoriously, who deserves it. It's, did your father pay the right guy the right amount of money to make sure you get that office? And there's a very rigid hierarchy of orders that you have to gain in order to rise in the Roman system that they create. And they add spots. It was called the cursus honorum. And it was to make sure that by the time you might be consul, you weren't some hot-headed 22-year-old kid. You were, 38, 40 years old, had spent some time in the legions, had spent some time in administration. You were seasoned at this point. You're going to make smart decisions for the country. Let's see. The professionalization of the army. This is a huge one. This is my favorite one right here. This is my personal pet favorite. Because one thing that we're going to see is that no longer are we going to have the citizen soldier who, sets down his plow and, takes up his rucksack and goes off on campaign work. Now what we're going to have, and who really just doesn't want to be out campaigning as soon as the war can be over. He wants to go back home, right? And but now instead you're going to have people whose only profession is soldiering. Even worse than that, in my opinion, is they're ultimately going to be dependent on their general paying them. It's not even the state. It's literally, can your general be successful enough to pay you? So you can see how this creates a potential serious conflict of interest here. So, the rise of generals. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Julius Caesar, they obviously begin to wield enormous political influence. And it's not exactly subtle. When Pompey shows up outside the gates, with his army out back, like, hey, I just need one or two quick things from the Senate, the threat is implied, right? It's like a soft coup, right? The threat of force is implied, and if you don't do it, so it's the same functional thing as if he had taken the soldiers in there and done something. So, political factionalism. I had said there were the aristocrats. There were the aristocrats who were looking to hold on to their power, the patricians, Okay, they have sort of it'd be wrong to think of these as political parties today. They were more just like factions who were opposed to each other. So you had the Optimates, that was the patricians, and the Populares. Now these didn't have to be poor people. In fact, the most successful ones of them were Aristotle, who was talking about how the patricians, who, they've been dissolute with their money and they've lost it all, and then they go to the people as poor people and like rile them up basically as demagogues. The most successful demagogues are actually going to be of those type. Let's see, right here. Yes, the murder of Gaius Gracchus, the social war. Okay, let's talk social war here. The social war. Basically, what's going to happen here is there's going to be a massive revolt of all the Italians. Because, again, you have all the commoners in Rome, the actual Roman citizens who are saying, hey, this republic is not seeming terribly fair. It's seeming to tend more toward oligarchy. And the Ottomans are saying, no, we don't care. We're not going to give you what you want. At the same time, you have all of these other people of Italy who by now have been living under Roman rule for centuries, right? It's not like they just conquered you yesterday, and you're still not a citizen. You still can't even vote. And so they basically petition to please have suffrage. It's not like suffrage automatically means anything, right? There's still a whole process of things you have to go through. And again, the patrician class says, no, we're not going to do it. And in fact, the guy who is agitating on behalf of the other Italians is murdered. Again, around the same time as like Gaius Gracchus and stuff. And so there's going to be a huge revolt. And it's going to be a very narrow thing. And it's going to require the leadership of people like Gaius Marius to put down this revolt of their fellow Italians. And basically what they do is they wind up just giving them Italian citizenship anyway. They wind up giving the Italians Roman citizenship anyway. So it's just this totally pointless war that really empowers Gaius Marius, who is one of the first guys who embraces like professionalization of the army. He's elected consul like 6 times. He's a real character. So that brings us to, yes, the social war. Okay, now Cicero is very alive. So Cicero witnesses the social war and the rise of generals as the predominant political figures. No longer is it a question of like, hey, we have this politician who's a consul, and oh, emergency time, now we need our consul to go lead us out into battle. Now it was, hey, here's this uber successful general who's coming back with all this plunder that he's got and all this political power because all of his boys, all of his soldiers are looking to him to get them fed when they get back, get them paid, and now he's becoming consul. So I hope that's clear. It's a subtle shift there, but you have politicians who are becoming generals in times of war, as opposed to now where you have uber successful military generals who are then coming back and as a function of their military success are now becoming the consul. So they're then taking political power. The social war, the first civil war, is going to be fought between 2 such generals who are basically just battling for control over Rome. It's going to be Marius and Sulla. Marius and Sulla. And if any of you are looking for a very accessible book on this first civil war, first round of civil wars, because I understand it can be a little opaque, there's a popular historian by the name of Mike Duncan who wrote a book called The Storm Before the Storm. And it's a highly accessible book. I gave it to one of my kids. Very accessible, very good. So, one thing that the first Civil War featured was just the naked exercise of power. I said Sulla shows up outside the gates, where literally the threat of like coming in there and killing all of you is just implied. Eventually, he does actually come back and kill a whole bunch of people, because what happens is, while he's gone campaigning in the east, that way is east, if you're looking at me this way, that way in the east, his political rival Marius comes in and kills a whole bunch of Sulla's supporters and family members. And so then when Sulla hears about this, he marches back and comes in and kills all of Marius's enemy, all of Marius's people. And so this is what Caesar saw growing up as well. Caesar was actually on Sulla's kill list because of his relationship to Marius. But Cicero is observing all of this. In fact, let's get a good picture. And here we go. So Cicero here, I'm going to bring up a nice picture of him here. Cicero here. There he is. Handsome fellow. He was actually not part of the patrician class, He was just an assiduously hard worker. He did not come from nobility, but he was an excellent student, a huge fan of the Greeks. His great boast was that he made every rung of the cursus honorum in his year. Like the first year that he was eligible to get promoted to a new office, he made it. And there'd only be a handful of you that made it in your year, and he did. So he was a very, very accomplished fellow in that respect. So the Republic, again, by the time he's an adult, the Republic is crumbling under the weight of social tensions, corruption, the ambition of military leaders. The first triumvirate, which is Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, is actually formed in 60. So as you can see here, 60. And actually, Cicero is invited to join. Cicero was invited to join this triumvirate. Now, what was the triumvirate? It was a power-sharing agreement. It was Rome's richest man, Crassus, partnering with its most successful general at that point, Pompey, and then Caesar was kind of the glue. Caesar was at that point a politician. Caesar was not yet famous as a general. He was just a politician really at that point. But this is going to be a way for them to divide up power and influence and basically control the political life of Rome. Even though, and I always like to emphasize this when I talk about this stuff in other classes, the Senate continued to meet and deliberate and pass laws and carry out business, even though that was all just a facade. The Senate would continue to meet long into the Imperium. After Augustan, after everything happened. I don't think the Senate stopped meeting until 100 AD or something like that. So on the outside, there's not one point where you can say, now it's an empire. It was just this slow transformation and the facade of voting and showing up and passing resolutions. That all carried on long after power had been concentrated in one person's hands or in a handful of people's hands. So, Cicero was a huge supporter of the Republic. He was a little bit of a romantic in that way. Kind of viewed himself as sort of a man out of his times. Like I said, he was looking back to this golden era of sacrifice for the state and civic virtue that he just saw completely devoid around him. It was so obvious. Caesar was notorious of bragging openly. This is one of the reasons his fellow patricians hated him. He was a patrician, but he was poor. That he would just say, oh, I don't need to worry about that legal problem. I paid this judge so much and so much money. And he'd just say it out loud. And it drove the other patricians just absolutely crazy because you weren't supposed to say that out loud. It's all part of the facade of Republican virtue that we have going on here. He loved to rub it in everyone's face that he was, able to manipulate the system in this way. And so, of course, Cicero naturally disliked him, right? And so when he is approached about joining this triumvirate, he says no. Caesar is worried about Cicero forming a basis of opposition. Cicero was known for his rhetoric. He was known for being a phenomenal public speaker. He was a lawyer and a politician. He was not really a soldier. He did do his small stint in the legions, but he got in and out as quickly as possible. He was not a soldiering fellow. I put a few of his major works on here. He wrote voluminously. I could not even possibly begin to put all of his works on one single slide. The ones that we are going to read are on the Republic, and we are also going to dabble in on the laws. Because as we can see here, these kind of go together. Cicero's foundational work on political philosophy, which is modeled after Plato's Republic, is going to present an idealized vision of Roman government in law. Okay? And as you can see, he's going to interpret the best type of government as that mixed constitution, that great middle, that one that mixes the best of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And then he's going to go on the laws to describe how this would work. What kind of laws do you need to put into place to make sure that this is what you wind up with? So it's an interesting companion piece. We only have bits and pieces of it. Obviously, your book only ever has sections of things. They're all incomplete. But actually, Cicero's own work survives only in the barest of fragments. In fact, it was lost for about 1,000 years. People knew it existed because people like St. Augustine, who we're going to talk about next week, references Cicero's works several times, but there were no known copies. They were finally discovered in 1801 or some 1818 or something like that. Okay, this right here I put on here. This was not. Sorry, forgot you can't do that. This right here. So these are actual books that were written, right? This one right here I put on here because these two I put on here because these are interesting. So the Philippics. These were a series of speeches that he gave where he attacked Julius Caesar's Master of Horse. Master of Horse was so the Roman Constitution had a dictator button. Okay, it was like, okay, we'll all vote and the Senate will do stuff unless we're in like super big lot of danger, in which case, boom, dictator time. We just need someone to take control and save the city. And they would use it every once in a while. The most famous of the dictators was Cincinnatus, the great Cincinnatus, who was called upon to be dictator in the early republic, and every time he was made dictator, which was multiple times, he would always lay down the office of dictator and go back to his plow, which is why George Washington loved him so much and founded the club called the Society of Cincinnatus. He's often called the American Cincinnatus. Julius Caesar was not a Cincinnatus type. He was more of a Sulla type. He was more of a, I'm going to be a dictator type. Mark Antony was his Master of the Horse. Master of Horse was like your number two. Your number two. He was a dictator too, but the only person he was answerable to was the dictator himself. Okay. Basically, Mark Antony, who plays a critical role in helping Caesar overthrow the Republic, Cicero is going to give a series of public speeches attacking him, vociferously attacking him. And this is actually going to cost him his life. Because later, when what's he calling himself at that point? The guy who eventually becomes Augustus, Julius Caesar's great nephew. When he and Mark Antony get together to divide things up before their round of civil war that ends with like Mark Antony and Cleopatra like dying in Egypt together, he basically says, look, if we're going to be partners, I need a couple of things. And one of the things I need is Cicero has got to be killed. Got to be killed. And Augustus liked Cicero well enough, but he wasn't able to save his life. So these speeches are pretty intense. This one I put on here too, even though this one actually comes chronologically before this. This was an interesting one here, because I found an error in your book actually when I was reading it. That happens from time to time. So the most famous thing that Cicero ever did in his term as consul was break up what's called the Catiline conspiracy. Basically, in the middle of the night one night, a messenger shows up at the consul's house, Cicero, and says, I've uncovered a plot to murder the leading men of the city and to overthrow the government. And Cicero says, whoa, hot dog, that's pretty serious stuff. We better break this thing up. So, they round up a posse and go grab these guys. And Cicero decides, well, they're too dangerous to be left alive. We better kill them. And so they do. Now, this is not exactly by the book, right? It's supposed to be like a trial, all of these different things. But Cicero decides, look, it's an emergency. I'm the consul. We're killing these guys, okay? The one person who voiced opposition to this in the Senate was Julius Caesar. Ironically, people think that he might actually have been involved, and that's why he advocated leniency. But it says here that he championed the execution of the conspirators without trial, an action that won him powerful enemies, leading to his downfall. That is not actually what led to his downfall. What happened was this right here. Interesting bit of personal politics within the empire here. Titus Annius Milo murdered Publius Clodius Pulcher, and Milo was defended by Cicero. Okay, this guy right here was the leader of a street gang, because by this point in the Republic, the only way that you could get anything done by a vote was to show up with muscle. You'd have a vote in the assembly, but it was not a vote that was, if it was a big vote, you could bet there were going to be guys there with like clubs and things could get pretty violent. So you needed to have a street gang of your own. So this guy right here, Publius Clodius Pulcher, hated Cicero. Not because of what he did to Catiline, but because Publius Clodius Pulcher was caught sneaking into the home of Julius Caesar to sleep with Julius Caesar's wife. And Julius Caesar knew that this guy could be a very dangerous political enemy. So in the trial, he says, basically, I don't know anything about it. And they said, well, you divorced your wife. So doesn't that mean that you thought that she was guilty? And he says, the wife of Caesar must be above suspicion. And that's how he kind of wiggles out of it. Cicero, though, Cicero's wife hates this guy's sister, whose name escapes me. And it's like, oh, you should totally just go humiliate him and testify and say that you know that it was him and he did it. And so he does. He does. But the guy gets off because Caesar won't testify against him. And so then Publius Clodius Pulcher basically uses the tribunate to go after Cicero. And so when this guy goes ahead and murders Pulcher in a street battle, Cicero's like, I got you. This one's gratis. Don't need to pay me. I'll take care of this. So that's why I put that one on there. So, okay. Yes, as I said, he is ultimately killed on the orders of Mark Antony, who hated him. Yeah, this is a guy who we're going to see it in here. There's just this longing for a better time here in his works. He's going to use the same sort of Socratic method, the same sort of Socratic dialogue here, but it's much less plotting, frankly. Like Plato's writing it's tough. No offense to Plato, but it's just so didactic and drawn out. It's like, just tell me. Just tell me already. What are you thinking here? Cicero gets right to the point. Cicero's an excellent writer. He's one of the favorites. He was heavily influenced by the Greeks. He studied under the Greeks, including at the Lyceum. And so you're going to get lots of great references here, and it's going to feel very familiar. There are only, let's see, if you don't have this copy of the book, let me know. Just show of hands. It's literally book 1 on the Republic. And in my version of the book, which again is the 4th edition, it is only 38. It's 7 pages. It's only 7 pages. It's absolutely tight, great 7 pages here. And they are going to go through what is the best form of government and why, and how do the various forms of government devolve and transform, which is, of course, what we're interested in. How does political order arise? How is it sustained? And what causes political transformation to occur? And we've already seen a couple explanations for this. In the case of Plato, he believed that essentially you had the philosopher king, right? The rule by the wise one, right? And that this was ultimately not going to be possible. So you'd have this whole cadre of them, right? You'd have a whole bunch of wise guardian types, right? But the guardians would eventually be supplanted in society by those whose valor in battle could defend the city and bring it honor and glory. But the more honor and glory you bring to the city, the more wealth you bring to the city, and eventually they will be displaced by an oligarchy whose motivating orientation is money and wealth. And that eventually this will so destroy the civic fabric of the city and its virtue that you will get the rise of democracy, which he of course believed was basically just mob rule. And then, of course, the democracy raises up a tyrant. Right? And then eventually, those wise, virtuous few aristocrats will eventually overthrow the tyrant and start the whole process all over again, right? And then in the case of Aristotle was much more subtle. He did not believe that there was only one way for this to happen. He goes into a whole variety of case studies. And in the case here that we're going to see, again, you're going to see a lot of very circumspect stuff here. It's going to be Scipio talking about how he would like to see the sort of balanced government. And what he's going to describe here is the Roman system that I detailed for you earlier, where you have essentially the power of a king, which is vested in 2 consuls, the Senate, which represents the aristocrats, and then the tribunate, which represents the people, the democracy. And that when you have them all working in perfect harmony and virtue together, this is the best regime. And this is what they view Rome as having had during its high period of glory, during about the middle of the 3rd century to the 2nd century, before the ultimate defeat of the Carthaginians removed that great enemy. You need an enemy, right? You need an enemy. I can't help but notice, being a political scientist and historian, that the period of really divisive, really fractious American politics, the rise of really intense political polarization in the United States, can be traced right back to the early 1990s and the end of the Cold War. Without the threat of the Soviet, what was it called? It was called the unipolar moment. The United States had no equal. We won. And now we're just rich and powerful, and now it was time for our elites to fight over the spoils, right? And politics gets very nasty in the 1990s. And it's very difficult. Who watched the debate? Who watched the debate? Okay, go back and watch the Kennedy-Nixon debate. Just watch a clip of it. Or go watch the Reagan-Carter debate. Watch the Al Gore-George W. Bush debate. It is so bizarre to see where we are now. I mean, it is hard to even comprehend how we got here. Just the level of vitriol and ad hominem attacks and just passionate hatred of both sides of the other, to the point where, you know, people are trying to, you know, kill the other person's candidates. You know, like, yeah, it's wild. But there you go. That's all I have for you today. This will go up. Please read on the Republic. I can't wait to talk to you all about it. We will do some dramatic readings. I want to hear your dramatic reading voices. I've done the reading so far when we do it in class. This time, on Wednesday, I will randomly call on you to give a very dramatic enactment. You are, of course, free to say no. But it is so fun. I hope you will. I will see you all on Wednesday. If you have any questions about the reading, please do just ask me.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, you as well.